Building knowledge base bots with Copilot Studio and SharePoint. So, Copilot Studio SharePoint. It's something a lot of people ask about, and today we're going to walk through it step by step. Now, moving on to what is Copilot Studio and why SharePoint makes the perfect knowledge source. Microsoft Copilot Studio is a low-code bot building platform within the Power Platform suite. It lets teams create, test, and deploy conversational AI agents without writing back-end code. Since 2024, Copilot Studio includes native generative AI capability, pointed at a document library, and it synthesizes answers from actual document content, not just pre-built dialogue topics. Microsoft's Copilot Studio documentation on Microsoft Learn covers the generative AI configuration in detail. SharePoint is where most Microsoft organizations already store their knowledge, HR policies, SOPs, product manuals, compliance guides, and IT documentation. Connecting Copilot Studio to that content is architecturally simple, and both products are already licensed under Microsoft 365 for most enterprise customers, which makes the cost case straightforward. Traditional chatbots require predefined topics, handcrafted responses, and constant maintenance for every new question variation. Copilot Studio's generative mode changes this. Give it a SharePoint source, set guardrails, and it answers questions directly from the documents. That cuts initial build time from months to days for knowledge retrieval use cases. Next up, moving on to how to build a Copilot Studio SharePoint knowledge base bot in 5 steps. The 5 steps to build a Copilot Studio knowledge base bot are: structure your SharePoint library, create your bot in Copilot Studio, connect SharePoint as a generative AI source, configure human-in-the-loop governance controls, and deploy with Power Automate monitoring workflows. Here is what each step involves in practice. Before opening Copilot Studio, clean up your SharePoint content. Create a dedicated document library for bot-accessible material, separate from general file storage. This controls exactly what the bot can see and prevents it from surfacing internal drafts or obsolete documents. Let's talk about now Azure infrastructure and security considerations for Copilot Studio deployments. Copilot Studio runs as a managed Microsoft service, so you don't manage compute directly. But the surrounding Azure infrastructure still requires attention, particularly if your organization is actively building out its Microsoft cloud environment or has recently completed an Azure app modernization project. An Azure architecture review before bot deployment should confirm. Organizations running a hybrid cloud Azure setup often find that a Copilot Studio deployment reveals identity and network configuration gaps that existed undetected. Better to find those in a planned review than after launch day. Now, moving on to Power Platform governance for Copilot Studio SharePoint bot projects. Power Platform governance directly affects what data the bot can access, which channels it can use, and who can modify its behavior after launch. Addressing this before the build begins is far less disruptive than retrofitting governance controls onto a deployed bot. Data loss prevention policies in Power Platform control which connectors can share data with each other. A bot using both SharePoint and an external third-party API may be blocked by a DLP policy that separates business and non-business connectors. Check your environment's DLP configuration before building. If you're working in a managed environment following Power Platform security best practices, you may need a connector reclassification or a policy exception from your Power Platform admin. Sorting this at the start costs an hour. Discovering it during user acceptance testing costs a sprint. Next up, real-world use cases for Copilot Studio SharePoint bots. A well-built Copilot Studio SharePoint bot is more than a search interface with a chat wrapper. The use cases where these bots reduce operational workload meaningfully are often more specific than teams initially assume, and the ROI case is clearer when you look at actual deployment patterns. Healthcare organizations face constant repetitive policy questions, PTO accrual rules, credentialing documentation requirements, HIPAA training deadlines, and leave policies. A Copilot Studio bot connected to the HR SharePoint site handles 60 to 80% of these queries without HR staff involvement, based on Q Services deployment benchmarks across healthcare clients. Banking and financial services firms have similar query volume with stricter traceability requirements. The bot's conversation logging combined with SharePoint's content versioning provides the audit trail compliance teams need for every policy answer the bot delivered, satisfying internal audit and regulatory review requirements. Let's talk about moving on to how to choose the right Azure consulting partner for your bot build. The technical work of building a Copilot Studio bot is accessible. The harder parts are governance design, integration with existing systems, and knowing when a bot is the right solution versus a Power Apps form or a SharePoint search improvement. That judgment is where a partner's experience shows. A capable Microsoft Azure consulting company building Copilot Studio bots should audit your SharePoint content before development starts, design the escalation and governance model before writing a single bot topic, and handle Power Platform licensing and environment configuration correctly from the beginning. Be cautious of partners who move straight to building topics without asking about your DLP policies, Teams deployment restrictions, or SharePoint content quality. Whether the engagement involves Azure Cloud Migration Services, Azure DevOps Consulting Services, or a Power Platform rollout, the pre-work determines the outcome. Now, let's talk about conclusion. A Copilot Studio SharePoint knowledge base bot is one of the fastest delivering investments in the Microsoft ecosystem. The technology is mature, the SharePoint integration is native to Microsoft 365, and the 5-step process in this guide gives your team a clear path from content audit to production deployment. The parts that catch most organizations off guard are governance configuration and SharePoint content quality, not the bot build itself. Q Services Azure Consulting Services team has guided healthcare, banking, logistics, and SaaS organizations through exactly this process, from initial SharePoint audit through post-launch monitoring. If you're ready to start or want to validate your approach before committing budget, download the Copilot Studio Quick Start Guide for our pre-deployment checklist, environment setup template, and governance configuration reference in one place. The faster you start, the sooner your employees stop hunting through SharePoint manually.